Welcome to the Green Lectionary Podcast, a production of Creation Justice Ministries. The Green Lectionary is a conversation on Scripture through the lens of creation justice. My name is Derek Weston, and today we'll be looking at a text for the final week of the season of creation, a time to renew our relationship with our Creator and all of creation through celebration, conversation, and commitment. For this episode, I'm joined by three guests. Wilson Dickinson, author of the recently released Singing the Psalms with My Son, Praying and Parenting for a Healed Planet. Debra Rienstra, author of Refugia Faith, Seeking Hidden Shelters, Ordinary Wonders, and the Healing of the Earth. And Katy Cuthill Steinberg, pastor of First Presbyterian Church in Daytona Beach, and co-author of Holy Leading, Thoughts, Meditations, and Practices for Whole Self-Leading. Join us as we look at Exodus 17 through the lens of creation justice.
Let the songs of the water, land, and sky resound, 'cause together we're all bound. Within these pages, there's always new life to be found.
Okay, our passage for this week comes from Exodus, chapter 17, verses 1 to 7. From the wilderness of Sin, the whole congregation of the Israelites journeyed by stages as the Lord commanded. They camped at Rephidim, but there was no water for the people to drink. The people quarreled with Moses and said, "Give us water to drink." Moses said to them, "Why do you quarrel with me? Why do you test the Lord?" But the people thirsted there for water, and the people complained against Moses and said, "Why did you bring us out of Egypt to kill us and our children and livestock with thirst?" So Moses cried out to the Lord, "What shall I do with this people? They are almost ready to stone me." The Lord said to Moses, "Go on ahead of the people and take some of the elders of Israel with you. Take in your hand the staff with which you struck the Nile and go. I will be standing there in front of you on the rock at Horeb. Strike the rock and water will come out of it so that people may drink." Moses did so in the sight of the elders of Israel. He called the place Massah and Meribah because the Israelites quarreled and tested the Lord, saying, "Is the Lord among us or not?" All right, friends. So where is creation in this story?
Well, I think one of the things that comes up for me early, and thanks for the invitation, Debra, to start us off, is the thinking that it's up to the humans to make the natural resource. And I think I kind of focused on this in our last conversation, that what's humanity's role in all of this, as far as it's how the earth provides and these kind of things. And it even harkens back to me thinking of Genesis. It was sort of like in this wonderful place where everything was provided, and that's not good enough. And then we come into Exodus, we've got this issue of folks being enslaved and having no freedoms and none of the things that they needed, or what the bare minimums of what they needed provided, and they're offered freedom from all that, and then end up complaining again that there's not what we need and it's not here. And I kind of resonate as a pastor with Moses on this, like, wait, why is this my problem? Wait, hold on. Like, all this, that I'm supposed to be the magic water person as well, that takes care of all the things. So yeah, without saying too much to start us off, I do think that what comes up for me is kind of what's humanity's role in this? What's God's role in this, in our well-being, in our sustenance, and where's the role of faith and trust? Because I always feel like, whenever I feel like I need to complain to God or to anybody, it sort of feels like if I had just been a little more patient, the answer was already coming. The sustenance, the was already being provided. The universe, the world, creation was already providing what I needed if I could have just been just a little more patient. But it's not within me as human. So those are kind of just the beginnings of inklings that come up for me.
Yeah, I love that. On the one hand, the story is so real that the people are complaining. I mean, it takes them like 4 minutes after the Exodus to start complaining. And I love that that's so real. And Moses is so exasperated and frustrated. And to be fair, they need water. That's life. This is a physical need. It's real. Nature is not always hospitable. It's a very real struggle. And on the other hand, there's some tension because the story is clearly interpreted by itself and then later in the New Testament as these are the Israelites being bad. They should not be testing God and complaining. So I kind of enjoy the tension in that story, because on the one hand, it's legit. They need water. And on the other hand, they need to trust.
Yeah, the thing that keeps on coming up for me in the story is this voice of complaint, but also like this voice of just survival, right? And it feels like that the people in the story that aren't named maybe are, it's the everyday Israelites, maybe even the women, right? Because the pushback is about, we're out here, and the children and the animals and us are gonna die of thirst. And that figure, and I guess Derek's question about where's creation really drew my attention to wilderness, right? So, they're out in the wilderness, and what is this figure of the wilderness?
Mm.
And which made me think of Dolores Williams, the womanist theologian, and she has this great line where she says that too often we're focused on the liberation of the Exodus, and we lose sight of the wilderness struggle, right? So the struggle that we've already kind of lifted up that it's of the Israelites, right? These are freed slaves, and they're just thirsty. But one of the things that comes out of this, without going on and completely rehearsing what Williams has to say, one of the things that comes out of this, I think, is the shift from liberation, right, which has us look at these kind of spectacular events, to wilderness struggle, really centers, at least what Williams says, it centers survival intelligence and visionary capacity. Right. So looking at this space of wilderness, right? So and seeing a certain kind of wilderness, and I guess maybe we can talk about different ways of understanding what that even is, I think brings to the fore a different kind of action, and especially a different kind of action when we're thinking about how to address issues of creation justice, right? So it's not necessarily all the spectacular stuff of liberation, but it's also the kind of the everyday tangle and communal activity of survival intelligence and visionary capacity.
I love that. This is a literary thought and maybe just a silly one, but these stories always remind me a little bit of the sequence in the middle of the Odyssey, the travels of Odysseus. I call that the Never Never Land sequence, where things get weird. And he's sort of off the map of real Greece and the Mediterranean. It's hard to pinpoint. And I think the same is true of some of the milestones or landmarks in these wilderness stories. It kind of becomes this weird Never Never Land sequence, and really remarkable stuff goes down. So it's not the big historical Exodus event, but it's these little moments of like quasi miracle magic stuff. And you're in the world of metaphorical interpretation, from the point of view of a modern reader, you're in that world when you're in these Never Never Land sequences. So I think we have to grapple with God's provision and the role of trust and the reality of physical need in this passage.
And the way you highlighted that, Wilson, too, brought up for me the struggle. And there's so much struggle as we look through scripture. There's so much struggle as we think about human life. There's so much struggle as we think about, the context in which these people were. And it just begs this really hard question for me about, is struggle necessary in some way? Is struggle part of what it means to be human? Or, I read a lot of Richard Rohr, and some of what I've been reading lately, he talks about the ways that struggle and love are intertwined. The ways that suffering and love are intertwined. And it feels so dangerous and scary for me to talk about, because it almost feels like, unless I'm talking specifically about my own struggles, it can feel like diminishing of the struggles of other people's. But it really begs for me to want to think about, what is the role of struggle in creation? What is the role of struggle in humanity? And how is that part of essentially what it means to be human and be in the human divine relationship as well? Because the reality is, we're sitting here analyzing this, but let's say this is a literal historical kind of idea. We don't know how much they were struggling. We don't know how thirsty they were. Were they really about to die? Were they just whiny? You know, like, and it can be interpreted any number of those ways. And but I think the reality is that it doesn't actually matter how thirsty you are when you feel thirsty. It doesn't matter if your suffering is as great as somebody else's suffering, or if I can measure it in some way and then apply it to other people, or some, it's just like the suffering is happening. They're expressing that the suffering is happening, and how do we interact and respond? And when it's wilderness too, there's something about wilderness that makes me feel like this is creation groaning in a way too. This is not the promised land. This is not the lush Garden of Eden as it's described. So there's lots of suffering I'm starting to pick up. So I appreciate you highlighting some of that struggle piece.
Well, that's what the word Israel means, struggles with God. So there's a sense in which that struggle is foundational to these people's identity. And by a kind of inheritance, our identity too is people of faith. Our job is engagement, and that engagement is not always calm and easy. It's often a struggle. Everyone is thirsty in the wilderness. And the wilderness is just a place where humans are decidedly not in charge. It's not designed for humans. It's designed for other purposes. And that's the theater of struggle with God, where these people have to learn a different way of engaging with their God.
Well, and to continue to rehearse some stuff from Dolores Williams, she has some good lines about the wilderness as a place of struggle, right? Because she wants to contrast a vision of wilderness that kind of like the American pioneer vision, right? Where the wilderness is a place that is savage and needs to be civilized, or it's a place that's idle and needs to be made productive, right? That's one account of wilderness. And that already came up. Katy was already talking about natural resources, right? That's kind of that outlook. There's the romantic European response to that, which is a direct pushback, right? Which says that what the wilderness is it's something that's pristine, it's something that's primitive. And so we go out there as individuals, and we go out there as individuals to experience some kind of solitude, right? And I think that kind of specter looms over a lot of environmental conversations, especially in white communities in the United States. But then there's also this kind of Black understanding of the wilderness, or African American, I guess I should say, understanding of the wilderness, that is, it's the wilderness is a place of refuge, right? So talking about kind of antebellum era slaves escape to the wilderness. But then there's also this kind of like Reconstruction, post-Reconstruction experience of the wilderness also as a space of struggle and trial. Struggle and trial of kind of this kind of religious experience, right? So there is this understanding of the wilderness, where the wilderness is a space, right, where you escape from something, and you don't just escape from something that's humans deal with, right? You escape from slavery, right? A structure of sin, a very specific historical formation, and I think that's a lot of what is going on with the Israelites, right? They're struggling with a very specific historical formation. They were slaves, right? And they're escaping, but now they're also struggling, and they're struggling to try and find something else. All right. So I think then I think that distinction is important, because then God is not the architect of their suffering, right? It's structural sin that the suffering is coming from. And it's also in the wilderness and through a struggle against that and towards something else, that's where faithfulness and hope begins to work its magic.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And, God says, okay, look, I'll solve the problem. And it's really interesting to me that God does it with a ritual, that God sets up this. I mean, God could have said to Moses, look, just go 5 miles east. There's a pool there. You'll be fine. But instead, God says, okay, you take your staff and you go in front of the people and you go up to this rock. At Western Theological Seminary, where my husband is a professor, they teach Hebrew primarily through immersion. And one of the ways they do that is they act out, they do reenactments of stories like this. And what happens when you do that is you wind up blocking the story. You have to figure out where bodies go. And one of the things they figured out when they were working on this passage is that Moses is in front of the people, And God stands on the rock. God says, I will be on the rock. So you have God above, lifted up.
Mm.
And then you have Moses striking the rock. And as Christians, it's impossible not to see you will see him lifted up, right? The resonance with the crucifixion. And actually in Corinthians, Paul actually says, Jesus is the rock. Paul refers to this story and identifies the rock with Christ. So that ritual striking is really interesting to me. Like, why doesn't God just say abracadabra or whatever? Why is it a staff? The staff that Moses used to make the Nile undrinkable back in Egypt is the one he's going to use to create or to release drinkable water here. Why is it striking? Why is that this violence, this violent ritual? But I think it's fascinating that it's a ritual and that it's a violent ritual. I don't know what to make of that. I just think it's really fascinating.
One of the things that I want to add to the conversation, at the point that they start to grumble, there is a questioning of why Moses brought them out of Egypt and why Moses brought them out of slavery. So it's not just enough to say that wilderness at this point has become a place of struggle. It has become a place of struggle to the extent that the human institution of slavery is preferable, that there is a longing for the empire, that there is a longing for the at least I had X, Y, and Z from the hierarchical system that we were a part of, and a willingness to settle for that institution versus the struggle that creation is inviting us into. That's, I mean, like, I can't imagine that these are people with amnesia, that they've forgotten what slavery was like. And so, as it is very much set up for us to feel, and Katy, I think for people who are in pastoral situations, I feel like it's very easy to go, yes, these are my whiny people, and why are they complaining about the color of the carpet? But it's more of a, like, the intensity of this struggle is so much that they would long for slavery. And so we have to think of the creation and the struggle in which creation is inviting them to, when we know that liberation is better than enslavement, and yet the struggle feels this severe. I also just want to very quickly note, because this is Wilson, you touched on this for just a second, that the other place where creation is in this passage is as they're grumbling, they describe their community. They're talking about the men, they're talking about the women, they're talking about the children, and they're talking about the livestock. And creation is a part of their community. Creation is part of this post-slavery community of organisms that is trying to find a new place to be. And so it's interesting that now that we could have the conversation of, like, are they putting livestock on the same level as women and children? That's also worthy of analysis, but at the very least, creation in the form of livestock are thought of as part of their community. And I just wanted to draw attention to those two things.
Mm-hmm.
So as we move forward, where is how's God calling us as humans to interact with creation based on some of the things that we hear in the story and based on some of the things that we've said already?
Based on some of what you have just said, Derek, it brings out for me just how scary it is to leave behind the things that we know and that are familiar, and just how entrenched we are even in our institutions and in our capitalism and how our world works, and how scary it is to break free from that and attempt to live differently. And in fact, to the point of where it feels nearly impossible to do that. And so then, and as they're in this space of this is impossible and we're all going to die, there's provision too, right? So that's part of the story for me as I think about what are the ways in which I can break out of the systems that are currently oppressive to the world, to creation, to people, and how fearful that is, and not knowing how long it's going to take, and not necessarily knowing exactly where you're going, and just being lost in that wilderness space, and probably, I don't know, even being the leader of, if you're being a leader in that space, hearing the people say, this is wrong, you're not doing it right, we're suffering, clearly this was a bad choice to try to break free of these systems, all along the way. And again, I'm struck by that it's not a human that's going to fix it in its entirety. It's a human leaning on God, it's leaders leaning on God, and God's the one who provides a solution. And the solution isn't we're going to go back to empire. The solution isn't we're going to reinvest in capitalism or whatever, but it's we're going to make it better this time. It's the daily bread thing. So we're going to get you through this moment, and it's not the first or the last time that the complaints will happen, and that this sort of liminal space is so long and so hard, and not all of us will see the end of it. And the invitation is go into the wilderness anyway, break free of the systems anyway. And for many of us, I think the call is, especially for those of us in pastoral relationships, and when I think of the space that the church is in these days, in the space of decline, and we're seeing articles come out from pastors who are totally burnt out, and we're seeing, all of these pieces, it's like, nobody said it would be easy. And the suffering's part of it. And we're given this promise that there will be provision along the way. It won't be glamorous, but it'll be enough. And that there is a promised land, there is a reason, and it's better than the thing we broke out of. So maybe that'll be light some fire under me in my thinking of my own practices to care for creation, but also to think in community leadership and modeling those things, even as we're told that's not going to work. You can't, that doesn't really make a difference. You can't do it that way. And in particular, I think I mentioned this the last time I got to be a guest with you, Derek, but my church has chosen to sell its building and all of its property and try to find a new way to be church with a smaller footprint. And we're quite literally wandering in the wilderness. And how might we be a different kind of community that can embrace that scary space, but also love and invest in creation and invest in caring for the world and each other along the way. So all that's spinning through my mind as we embrace this conversation.
Wow, this is real for you, Katy. Yeah, I think so often we'd rather deal with a devil we know than trust the God who's a mystery. And this is hard. I mean, in some ways, I think, does Moses, if we could think of Moses as the church, and the world is asking, ask your God to fix all this. And the church is like, why is this about me? And, in fact, so often when it comes to dealing with climate change and the challenges of environmental justice, we are not the ones walking in front of the people. The rest of the world is doing the striking of the rock or whatever, and not always us. The church is not always the one leading the way, as Moses winds up doing. If only we had a magic staff, man, that would help so much. Oh, the other thing I was going to say is, as you were saying, Katy, it's not that God says, oh, listen, you all are thirsty. How about if you settle by this beautiful river and all is well? They're still on the way. They're still in this liminal space. They're still in process. And what they're given is enough, but it's not established abundance, which is what they're headed for. And even that's going to be a struggle. But it's just right on the heels of that manna story. It's enough for now. Trust me. I'm leading you through this.
Yeah, when I was thinking about how, what it would look like to preach this, which I'm not going to have to, but thinking about, the kind of action out of it, and also maybe even the listeners, I could imagine this being a really powerful story, thinking about exactly what Katy and Debra and you, Derek, have been talking about. Just is how hard it is in the wilderness, right? And trying to do things in alternative ways is exhausting and terrifying. And there are all kinds of rituals that permeate our lives that teach us to trust in the security that is offered by empire, right? So, and it gets into our spirits. And so it feels very insecure to even push against that, much less be on the way out to something else. So I could see this story as being very powerful for talking about, what is survival intelligence? What is resiliency? And there is a vision here, right, of creation becoming new creation, right? Of the desert that empire created, water coming out of it, right?
Mm-hmm.
I could also see this passage though as being, because I'm guessing there probably aren't, though it sounds like, Katy has one. I'm guessing a lot of congregations don't feel like they're out in the wilderness wandering. They probably feel like they're terrified to start that journey.
Mm.
And so I think I think the interpretive history of this passage then is interesting, to where the legacy, at least that I'm thinking of with this passage, right, is Isaiah, right? Isaiah 35 and 41, these images of God making springs in the desert.
Oh,
And so there's a new Exodus. And so God makes creation new. And when you journey out to the desert, you will find that. And there's like and in that prophetic poetry, there's a degree of participation going on, right? So I think the story is telling a story about Big Daddy Moses and Big Daddy Sovereign God doing this stuff. But I think those are also figures for how there is grace, and then there's the participation in grace, right? The sanctified grace of the community that does things in the world, that transforms things.
Mm.
So I think that the prophetic imagery does that. And also I think that another legacy of this passage that Debra brought up is Paul, right? 1 Corinthians 10, he talks about this, but this water he talks about in terms of Eucharist, right? And so Eucharist for Paul also, not this highly ritualized space outside of everyday life, but kind of counter-imperial meals happening around a table with these kind of gatherings of people trying to live a different kind of life, right? So I think that for those communities maybe that are afraid of entering into the wilderness, I think there's a lot of like visionary power here to think about, well, yes, it isn't easy, but this is where new creation comes from. And it comes from also the power that exists in our community doing different stuff.
Yeah, that's really helpful. And the thought of leaning on these precious sacramental rituals in these times of upheaval and change. That's what was so cruel about the pandemic, when we were quarantined and we couldn't do Eucharist together. That was real starving. I am really encouraged by this story, much like the story of Jesus with Thomas after the resurrection, where, yes, the Israelites are, well and truly scolded in this story for testing and dissatisfaction. That's what those two Hebrew words mean, that they named the place, testing and dissatisfaction. Not a place you want to go on vacation, I guess. So that, the Israelites are well and truly scolded in this passage, and yet God responds with grace, just like Jesus does with Thomas. I mean, poor Thomas, right? He wasn't there when Jesus showed up, and it's legit. It seems crazy what the other disciples claim. And Jesus graciously says, touch me, see. And I feel like this is God doing the same thing with the Israelites. Look, stop complaining, but I will answer you. I will answer you with grace, the grace of this ordinary miracle. I mean, we could figure out like what happened when Moses struck the rock or whatever, just sort of hydrologically speaking, we could figure that out, I guess, but that doesn't make it less of an ordinary miracle, a miracle of grace, even though the Israelites demonstrated their very understandable lack of trust and complaining, God still responds with grace.
I keep coming back to this idea that several of you have touched on of God didn't give them from the rock water and then like jugs, and so that they had more water to like travel with. So they had travel water, and then like refrigeration, so they had water to keep cool for later, and freezers, so that God gave them water for the moment and for that leg of the journey.
Mm.
And so often what we seek from creation is the abundance that we can store for later. And so often what creation has to offer is the sufficiency for the day. And I think part of where I see the interaction with creation is us beginning to ask less of nature, us beginning to say, yeah, though, thank you for the water from the rock. I actually wasn't expecting water from a rock. This is actually really great. And I have water that will keep me going until maybe there's another water fountain rock later on in the journey. That'll be great too. But what develops is sort of through the wilderness is an economy of sufficiency that like they never have they really never have more than enough. In fact, God discourages them with the manna from storing for the future. God tells them to have restraint, and to develop an idea of enoughness.
Yeah.
And this is just it's a theme that I feel like has come up over and over again, and one that I'm kind of finding is that there's a defining of enough that creation actually does for us if we're willing to listen and be in right relationship there. And we're usually very much in opposition to creation's definition of enough. And I'm just really struck by the fact that in all of the places where, there are so many places where scripture is calling or where we get visions of abundance in scripture, but this particular formative moment for the people of Israel is not one of them. It is one of continually going to God and God saying, here's what you need for today, move along.
Yeah, that's the maybe the bitter irony of naming this place testing and dissatisfaction, when we should be naming every place satisfaction and contentment.
That's really good. So where is there in all of this that we've kind of mined from this passage, and there's a lot, where is there a call to action for the church from this passage and the thoughts that we have gathered from it?
That wandering without knowing where the next sort of meal comes from, if you will, or the next drink comes from, is just so striking to me and just so terrifying and so countercultural. I think about that little parable of the squirrel and the grasshopper, and the squirrel saves up the nuts for the winter and the grasshopper doesn't, and the grasshopper perishes, and the squirrel, whatever, he comes to the squirrel and begs for whatever version of it, but it's really terrifying, and it's really countercultural for us to take a step out of the norm, to take a step out of what we've been taught culturally and institutionally, and how we've taught to be successful, and to do something different, and then to trust. And I'm telling you, you've got to hold the things so loosely, because it isn't faith if you know how it's going to turn out, you know? And so with our knees trembling, which is not a place that Americans like to be. We want to be powerful and in charge and make things happen. And that has woven its way into our institutions as well, especially I think as, again, we watch church decline happen. There's a sense of like, grasp at everything, white knuckle it, save it up, don't waste it, don't let it go. And in this passage, I hear an invitation to do it different, to trust, to step out anyway, even in spite of the fact that it looks like everything's going to end and die and we're all going to die of thirst. We take the next right step anyway. And we don't, and I also feel like there's an invitation to like whine about it too. Like, that's okay. Like, this is what we do. We can whine about it a little bit. We can complain. God can handle it, and then and still trust, even as we have to express all of our big feelings. That's why I tell my children, you can express your big feelings and and get through it anyway. But it's just so scary though.
And I think one of the important parts of this story is, like, everybody has big feelings in the story, right? I mean, like, including God, right? Including Moses. And so part of this story is, it's just kind of maybe telling us that the way you build trust, the way you build faithfulness isn't always easy. It's especially because, we're not starting from a place of clean slate, right? Like, why do former slaves not trust? Well, part of it was probably they were slaves, right? And who do they trust? What kind of world have they lived in to cultivate trust, right? And so, and I mean, I do not want to equivocate between, slavery and the condition that all of us find ourselves in. But I think that the systems that organize our lives are set up to literally sever bonds of trust, right? They're made to individuate us. They're made to turn things into commodities, right? It's there's all this severing of connection that is the very logic of the systems that we serve, right? And that give us the food that we need for our lives. And so we're all starting this situation traumatized, right? Or also just injured. And so it's understandable that we don't trust. It's understandable that this is terrifying, right? But the way to get to trust and faithfulness and a community where, you take care of each other, and a relationship with creation where you take care of each other, there's going to be some struggle there, right? But like you all are saying, it's going to take some stepping out, some risk, but also the risk is mitigated by communal sharing, right? And it's mitigated by the fact that creation and the Creator will help bear it with us.
And I wonder if the church can, even as we're undergoing our own struggles of change and upheaval and the breaking down of institutions and systems, many of them for good reason, and the experimenting with what comes next, even while we're doing that, everybody else is doing that too. I mean, we're all going through really intense periods of change in lots and lots of ways, and that's only going to continue. And I wonder if the church can say to others in whatever ways are appropriate, listen, we have these stories. We are trying to lean into these stories and these ritual practices because we know from the witness of the ages that these are life-giving and these are ways to get through wildernesses. And would you come and join us? Would you be with us in this struggle? It's not easy for any of us, but we have these stories. We have this God. We have this faith. If that's something you need, come share it with us.
So I've written down 3 things. One, I had a friend who had a mantra basically the mantra was, I will not long for Egypt. And I think one of the calls to action here, and Deborah, I think you're right. This isn't just about the church. I think this is for a lot of our institutions. There is this nostalgia for a time when things were great, and we want to make them great again. And what that is longing for Egypt. What that is trying to take us backwards to a time when there wasn't actually freedom, and the journey towards liberation is a hard one. It is a difficult one, and in the midst of that struggle, you don't diminish the struggle, but you don't sit in longing for the place of domination and empire. So that's one thing. The second thing is, again, kind of coming to this moment of what can we do for the day, and that the rock gave water for that particular leg of the journey. So often we think of solutions and we think of their longevity. And if it's not a such solution that's going to have longevity, then it's not a valid solution. And some things are just to last for a season. And I think of this, Katy, particularly in our denomination, in the PCUSA. Katy's a part of this 1001 new worshiping communities movement from the PCUSA. And a lot of those worshiping communities that were part of that movement closed and have ended. And I think a lot of people would look at that as like, that is failure. But for the people who were a part of those worshiping communities at those times, when they desperately needed, when they had felt alienated from church, the 5 or 7 years that those worshiping communities lasted were incredibly meaningful years. And those people were getting water in the desert. And I think we feel like if something doesn't last forever, then somehow it failed. When so often what God is calling us to are water and from the rock solutions. I've been doing a lot of work around community gardens, and there's always someone who pushes back of like, well, community gardens aren't going to solve all of the food insecurity issues. Like, no, they're not, but they're doing more than doing nothing. And they are, for those people in those moments in those places, a genuine solution to a problem. And so I just don't think we don't need all of our solutions to be permanent fixes. And that's part of what I'm getting as a call from the story. And then the last thing, which is a less serious thing, is just kind of thinking about God's relationship with Israel and Moses's relationship with the people of Israel, and just kind of thinking about like snark as a love language, and thinking about how, like, in our relationships with, like, if anyone who spends any time with me and my wife recognize that, like, snark is very much a love language in our house, and that there is a little bit of like, you're testing me, and you're testing me only in a way that someone I love so much can test me. And like, I don't think we should shy away from that way of reading these passages, because this is the snark and the complaining and the testiness that can only happen when you give someone the access to your life, the vulnerability of being in a loving relationship with them. And so I think part of the call that I'm hearing in this passage is just not to shy away from, the most loving of relationships is going to have this moment of, oh my God, why did you give me this person? Why did you give me these people? Why do they test me so? And I just think that, that is part of, thinking about this connection between suffering and love, thinking about this connection between the tension that comes with our vulnerability and our intimacy.
That's so
maybe
wise.
maybe we don't need to gloss over those things.
Well, I wonder too if that's one of the reasons for the striking. If Moses is striking the rock on which God stands, it must have been, if you think about that, just staging that, right? It's a really disturbing image of Moses essentially striking God, and God instructing him to do this. Like, yeah, I feel this, you guys complaining, but I'm in relationship with you, and I'm in it for the covenant long haul, and I'm willing to take a few blows from you people, and in return give you provision. It's an incredible image of grace.
If I go back for a second to what you were saying, like I guess your second point, Derek, about not being a lasting solution, which I think that's also wisdom. I also wonder if one of the dynamics here is what's often counted as a solution, right? So I think like the rock and mountain where like the water comes from is like adjacent, right? It's part of the whole Sinai kind of matrix, right? And so there's a connection that's being made between law and this kind of miracle of water, renewal of creation, right? So there's this pointing to this entire way of life, right? It's about communal equity in a lot of ways. And so I wonder if part of the solution or part of the action that we're being called into is to look at the things that aren't counted, right? So the things that are literally externalities in our accounting systems, right? So in our accounting systems, power creation and the debts created by extracting from creation, those are not included in our business accounting schemes. Also, I think like in the global South, a lot of times, a lot of the labor of women is getting water, right? And so, and the labor of care and that kind of communal labor, not counted, right? But so maybe some of the lasting things that come out of the state, they don't get a well, they don't have a water system with pipes, they don't get their water every day from here on out, but they do start to build this communal power, right? Represented in the law, also represented in these acts of care and acts of collaboration with creation. And so maybe part of the call is to look at care, look at creation, look at these other forms of power that we can trust and that will sustain us.
And, just to tag on to that too, Wilson, this very unpopular for leaders to say, we don't know how it's going to turn out. Institution hates that. People get uncomfortable, and it is one of the most faithful and authentic things that a leader can say. So, if the call is start the journey and God will provide. Okay, so what's the 5-point plan and where does it go? And where's the next watering hole? And okay, so how long is it going to take us to get there? And how many rations do we need? And can I fill up my Camelback? Like, I don't know. I don't know, but I know the next faithful step. So let's take that and trust.
That feels like a good place to end. Well, Debra, Katy, Wilson, thank you so much for engaging the scripture and in this way, for thinking about creation in this passage, and for bringing your wisdom and insight to the Green Lectionary. Thank you all so much.
Thanks. It was really fun, as always.
Thanks, Derek. Good to see you guys.
Thanks, Derek. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you for joining us for the Green Lectionary podcast. This episode was produced by Derek Weston, and the music was provided by Christian McIver. Please like and subscribe wherever you get your podcasts and help us spread the word with a good review. Leave us a comment to let us know how you've used the show and how we can make it more useful for your ministry. You can learn more about this and other programs of Creation Justice Ministries at creationjustice.org.
Our story comes alive within these pages, for every time and place throughout the ages. God speaks and is heard, and the enduring word calls us to care for our world as we share the love that can set creation free. Restoring the earth to wholeness, peace, and harmony. Let the songs of the water, land, and sky resound, 'cause together we're all bound. Within these pages, there's always new life to be found.